I was 24 when I began my 2-month internship at St. Moritz Forensic Hospital in southern Germany. It was 1978, a humid summer that seemed to make every hallway in that building smell like bleach and sweat. The hospital was famous or infamous, depending on who you asked. It was one of the few forensic institutions in the country where inmates with severe psychiatric disorders were placed under Sicherungsverwahrung, what we called security detention. That meant that even after serving their sentences, they stayed there indefinitely if the state considered them too dangerous to release. The facility was split into 2 wings. The first was for the acute cases, the ones who screamed through the night, smashed their heads against walls, or hallucinated entire wars. That was where the freshly psychotic and chemically lost were sent. The second wing, the one where I worked, was quieter, cleaner. It was where they sent the long-term patients, the ones whose madness had been dulled down by years of medication and sedation. On paper, these were the stable ones. In practice, I learned something unsettling. Stability doesn't mean safety. My role was simple. I observed, took notes, handed out medication, and assisted the night staff when needed. I told myself it was just a job glimpse into the human mind before I began my psychology studies. But after one night in that hospital, I stopped believing that madness was confined to patients alone. The night shifts were always the hardest. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly in the corridors, the air smelled faintly of iron and disinfectant, and the hum of the old ventilation system was the only sound breaking the silence. In our secured wing, there were about 20 patients. Most were pedophiles, murderers, or arsonists deemed unfit for normal incarceration. But because of their heavy medication, they seemed almost harmless, sluggish, detached. They would sit in the day room, drooling slightly, staring at the muted television or flipping through the same torn magazines every night. Their eyes were dull from the medication that suppressed not only their impulses, but it seemed their humanity too. I remember one of the senior nurses telling me on my first night, "Don't ever assume quiet means calm. Some of the most dangerous ones don't scream anymore, they just wait." That sentence stuck with me. The night routine was predictable. 2 nurses would patrol the hallways and rooms while one stayed in the office monitoring the surveillance feeds. Our office separated the living quarters from the secured exit, an automatic steel door with a camera and an alarm system. Most nights were dull. We'd drink coffee, watch the monitors, and count the hours until sunrise. But as the nights went on, I started noticing small things that felt off. The cameras in the east corridor would sometimes flicker just for a second like a frame was missing. We checked the wiring, nothing wrong. Sometimes the automatic door to the hallway would click softly in the middle of the night, like someone was testing it. It always stayed locked, but it was enough to make your stomach tighten. And then there was room 17. A woman named Ank Weiss lived there. She'd been there for nearly 15 years, convicted of killing her husband and his mistress, claiming they had serpents inside them. She was calm, now medicated beyond emotion, but I never liked looking her in the eyes. They were empty in the way deep water is empty. You can't tell how far down it goes. She spent her nights sitting on the edge of her bed, humming a slow, tuneless melody. Whenever I passed her door during rounds, she'd stop and look toward me, never at me, toward me, as if listening to something behind me instead. Once, I asked one of the doctors what she was diagnosed with. He said, "Schizoaffective disorder with residual delusions. She's harmless now." "She's one of the chilled ones," I tried to believe him. Until the night she left her room, it was my 4th week. A night shift like any other cold coffee, stale cigarettes, and the quiet hum of the surveillance monitors. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I felt it. That instinctive animal feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up from my clipboard toward the small window beside my desk. The hallway lights reflected faintly in the glass, turning it into a dark mirror. And in that reflection, just over my shoulder, I saw her. She was standing half hidden behind the office door, smiling at me. Her hair hung over one side of her face, her hospital gown loose, her head tilted slightly, like a child watching something amusing. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe I was overtired, a hallucination from staring at the monitors too long. But then she moved, slowly, her hand sliding along the doorframe. She whispered something I couldn't hear, her lips barely moving. My body reacted before my mind did. I jumped from my chair, hit the panic button on my pager, and backed into the far wall. The alarm buzzed faintly through the floor. Seconds later, my two colleagues rushed in, unlocking the security door from the patient corridor. When I pointed toward the door, Ink was still standing there smiling, not moving. Her eyes were wide, her breathing calm, almost serene. She didn't speak. We restrained her gently and brought her back to her room. She didn't fight. She just kept smiling until we closed the door behind her. After we sedated her, the three of us went to check how she had escaped. Her room was still locked from the inside. The door hadn't been tampered with. And the security door, the only way into our office, hadn't been opened once. We checked the surveillance footage. Nothing. No movement. No door opening. No Ink leaving her room. The feed just jumped from one frame to the next, skipping about 8 seconds. 8 seconds where the screen went black. That shouldn't have been possible. We checked the system, the power supply, everything. Nothing was wrong. But when we zoomed into the last frame before the cut, my blood went cold. In that single frozen image, the door to room 17 was open just a few centimeters. And through the crack, you could see her face, smiling. The system log showed no record of the door being unlocked. The only record that existed was of me pressing the alarm seconds later. We filed an incident report. The supervising psychiatrist dismissed it as a system error and staff fatigue. He said we must have left her door slightly open during the previous check. But I knew we hadn't. That next night, I refused to sit near the window. A week passed. No incidents. Until the last night of my internship, I remember it too clearly. It was 3:12 a.m. My colleagues were making rounds again, and I was alone in the office, watching the cameras. I was still uneasy about what had happened, so I kept glancing over my shoulder, making sure the door behind me was locked. And then I noticed something strange on the monitor. Room 17's camera was offline. Just static. That wasn't unusual. The old system glitched often, but this time, it wasn't just visual noise. Through the static, I could hear something. A low rhythmic hum, not from the speaker, from inside the room, from the corridor outside the office. My heart dropped. It was the same tune Ink used to hum at night. I turned toward the door. The small glass pane was dark, reflecting only the faint glow of the monitors. And then, just like before, I saw it. Her reflection, closer this time. Her smile wider. I didn't move. Couldn't. My hand hovered over the alarm, but I was too terrified to press it. Her reflection's mouth moved slowly, silently. And then I realized something horrifying. She wasn't standing behind the door. Her reflection was in front of me. The angle was wrong. I turned, and the hallway was empty. But when I looked back at the glass, her reflection was still there, tilting its head, watching me. I don't remember screaming. But my colleagues said they found me unconscious on the floor when they returned. When I woke up, the doctor said it was a panic attack exhaustion, nothing more. They told me Ink had been asleep in her room the entire time. The door was locked. No one had left, but I saw the footage later. At 3:12 a.m., room 17's camera had gone to static for 47 seconds. And when it came back, Ink was sitting up in bed, humming softly, her eyes fixed directly on the camera. I left St. Moritz the next morning. I didn't even collect my full pay. For years, I told myself it was just exhaustion, sleep deprivation. But something about that place never left me. I learned later that Ink died 2 years after I left. Apparently, she'd stopped eating, saying her body wasn't hers anymore. They found her one morning sitting up in bed smiling. The report said it was heart failure. But when I visited a former colleague years later, he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said after Ink's death, the night staff started complaining about reflections. They'd see faces in the office window at night, smiling women, half hidden behind the door. And then the camera system in the east corridor started glitching again, always for exactly 47 seconds. No one could ever explain it. Even now, decades later, I can't look at my own reflection in dark glass without feeling my stomach tighten. Sometimes late at night, when I pass by a window, I think I see movement where there shouldn't be any, and every time I do, I make sure not to look too closely, because I know what I'll see if I do. That smile, waiting. If you ever work the night shift in a hospital, and you start feeling like someone's watching you through the glass, don't turn around. Because sometimes the reflection looks back. I worked at St. Margaret's Forensic Hospital from 1973 until 1979. It wasn't the kind of hospital you could leave unchanged. You didn't forget the smell of antiseptic that clung to every corridor, or the sound of metal doors closing behind you with a final, echoing click. I was a psychiatric nurse back then, young, idealistic, convinced I could help even the most broken people. St. Margaret's housed those who had crossed the line between illness and crime, patients deemed unfit for prison yet too dangerous for the outside world. It was where society put the people it didn't want to see again. Our wing held 22 men, each with their own brand of madness. But two of them, two faces I still dream about, would define my time there. One was Thomas Greer, a soft-spoken father of 5 who de-butchered his family after claiming the devil made him do it. The other was Elaine, a woman with what they called multiple personality disorder back then, 3 people living inside one fragile body. They were both calm, cooperative, and terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with violence. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what people do. It's the quiet conviction that they being guided by something we can't see. Rising unease approximately equals 950 words. Thomas arrived first, late spring of 1975. His case file was thick as a phone book, but the part that stood out most was what the detectives wrote. Claims ongoing communication with a demonic entity instructing his behavior. He looked ordinary. Short brown hair, pale eyes, and a stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. During intake, he thanked me for bringing him his tray and asked politely if he could have milk instead of water. Not a hint of aggression, but when I asked if he understood why he was here, he smiled faintly and said, "God knows." The devil told me to finish the work, but he stopped me halfway. The doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and started him on Thorazine. He rarely spoke, though sometimes I'd find him staring at the ceiling for hours, lips moving as if whispering to someone unseen. Elaine was different. She'd been transferred from a civilian hospital the following year, a fragile woman in her 30s who sometimes spoke in the voice of a 6-year-old. Her condition fascinated the psychiatrists, a living case study in dissociation. During art therapy, the child painted rainbows and stick figures. But when threatened or startled, another voice, deeper, older, measured, emerged. She'd say, "Don't hurt her. I'm watching you," with the gravity of a grandmother protecting her kin. There was supposed to be a third personality, an adult woman named Marie, who barely surfaced except during interviews. I once asked her who the older voice was supposed to be. She smiled weakly. She's the one who knows what happens at night. At St. Margaret's, night was when the building came alive. The hum of fluorescent lights mixed with distant muttering. Patients woke screaming from dreams, doors rattled in their frames, and sometimes the monitors flickered with static, just enough to make you wonder if it was the building or your mind slipping. One night, I passed Thomas's cell during rounds and found him sitting upright, eyes fixed on the corner of the room. His lips were moving. "Thomas?" I whispered. He didn't blink. Just said softly, "You shouldn't be here after lights out." He doesn't like witnesses. I assumed he was hallucinating. But when I turned to leave, I felt something like a vibration in the air, the kind that makes your teeth ache, as if electricity were running through the walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. Then silence. For weeks after that, small things started going wrong. Medication counts were off. The intercom clicked on by itself. Once, I found a crucifix drawn in charcoal on the staff room wall. No one admitted to it. Elaine's personalities grew agitated, too. The 6-year-old cried more often. The older voice, the protector, began warning us not to let him in. When asked who him was, she simply said, The man who whispers to Thomas when no one else can hear. By the end of the month, 2 patients had injured themselves, claiming to see faces in the mirrors. The chief psychiatrist blamed mass hysteria. I wasn't so sure. Climactic horror approximately equals 1,200 words. It was a Wednesday night in October, 1976, my last night shift before scheduled leave. The air inside the ward felt heavier than usual. The heating system hummed, but every now and then the pipes made a hollow, thudding sound like a heartbeat in the walls. Around midnight, I did my rounds. Lane's room light was still on. I peeked in. She was sitting on her bed, humming softly, painting small circles in red watercolor. It looked like she was drawing eyes. "Elaine, it's past lights out," I said gently. She didn't look up. "He's coming for the children again." I froze. "Who? The man with no name?" she whispered. Then her head jerked, and in a low, raspy tone that wasn't her own, the older voice spoke. "He's already here." Before I could respond, the emergency alarm blared from the next corridor, Thomas's room. I sprinted down the hallway, heart pounding, the fluorescent lights flickering as if struggling to stay awake. When I reached his door, it was wide open. Thomas stood in the middle of his room, shirtless, muttering in a rhythmic whisper. The air reeked of iron. His hands were bleeding. He'd carved something into the walls. "Thomas," I shouted, grabbing my radio. "Put the object down." He turned to me, calm as ever, eyes glazed, but aware. "They said she was the vessel," he murmured. "The child in her belly belongs to him." My skin went cold. I realized he wasn't talking about his murdered children. He was talking about Elaine. Suddenly, the lights cut out completely. The entire ward went black. All I could hear were footsteps. Not Thomas's heavy ones, but something lighter, skittering along the floor. The emergency generator kicked in a few seconds later, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Elaine stood in the doorway of Thomas's room, her hospital gown soaked with paint, or blood, I couldn't tell. Her eyes were blank white, and she was clutching one of her paintbrushes like a knife. Thomas smiled. "He found her," Elaine screamed, 3 voices at once, overlapping like a broken radio signal. Her body convulsed, and for a split second I swear I saw her face shift. Child, woman, elder, all flickering between each other like strobe flashes. Thomas lunged forward, but before I could react, she drove the brush handle into his neck. He fell instantly, gurgling, blood spreading across the white tile like spilled ink. She collapsed next to him, shaking violently, whispering, "He's gone now. He's gone." By the time security arrived, Thomas was dead. Elaine was catatonic, unresponsive to any stimuli. They sedated her and transferred her to isolation. Later, when they cleaned the room, they found what he'd carved into the walls. Over and over again, in uneven letters, "She is 3, he is 1. Aftermath approximately equals 500 words. An investigation followed, of course. The administration ruled it a psychotic episode triggered by medication imbalance and stress. I wasn't convinced. Elaine was moved to a high-security ward placed under constant observation. She never spoke again. The doctor said her personalities had integrated, but the way she stared at visitors, expressionless, like an empty vessel, made me doubt that. Thomas's death was listed as self-inflicted trauma, though none of us saw him move his hands after she struck. No weapon was recovered. Just the blood-soaked brush handle snapped in half. A few weeks later, maintenance workers began repainting his room. Under the peeling paint, they found older carvings, ones that didn't match Thomas's handwriting. Some were in different languages. One read simply, "He lives where the minds are many. I left St. Margaret's the next month." I couldn't walk those corridors without feeling watched. The humming lights, the smell of bleach, the endless whisper of wheels on tile, all of it reminded me that something still lingered there. Years later, I learned that St. Margaret's was shut down after a fire destroyed the East Wing. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but the strange part? The blaze started in Thomas's old room. They said the night nurse on duty claimed to see someone standing there just before the fire, a woman in a white gown, humming softly with 3 shadows stretching out behind her. YouTube outroll, approximately equals 180 words, Sometimes I wonder what really happened that night. Did Thomas believe the devil spoke to him, or was it something darker that used his madness as a doorway? And Elaine, were those voices fragments of trauma, or something sharing space inside her that shouldn't have been human? I've told myself for years it was just the sickness of the mind, chemicals and delusions colliding until reason broke apart. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I still hear it, that faint humming like someone painting in the dark. I worked at St. Augustine State Hospital for the Insane from 1974 until 1979. It was a sprawling Gothic structure built sometime in the early 1900s, sitting on the edge of a small Pennsylvania town that no one outside the county had ever heard of. The locals used to call it the Hill because it sat up high, overlooking the trees like a dark sentinel. I was 27 when I started there, a new orderly, fresh out of training, trying to make a living in a place that always felt 2 decades behind the rest of the world. Everything about St. Augustine felt old. The paint was peeling, the pipes hissed and groaned, and every hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant, metal, and something sour like spoiled milk. The patients ranged from the harmless and catatonic to the violent and unpredictable. We had veterans who still woke up screaming from Korea, women who'd lost everything after one breakdown too many, and even a few who'd simply been abandoned by their families. But there was one patient and one night that changed me forever. It happened in the East Wing, the surgical recovery ward. A woman who had recently undergone surgery after swallowing a foreign object, something she shouldn't have survived. And though I've told myself countless times it was just trauma or shock, I still can't forget the look in her eyes that night, because she wasn't supposed to be alive, not the way she was. Rising unease, the patient's name was Margaret Fields. She was 32, admitted 2 months before the incident for what the intake notes described as severe self-harm tendencies with psychotic features. The first time I saw her, she was lying in her bed near the window, her dark hair matted to her face, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling like she was watching something the rest of us couldn't see. She had swallowed something metal. They never told me exactly what, but the rumor among staff was that it was a small crucifix. The surgeons removed it after a 6-hour operation, leaving her abdomen stapled shut with a long incision that looked raw and angry. The recovery was slow, and the doctors were cautious. She barely spoke, ate very little, and had to be sedated at night because she declawed her stomach when she thought no one was looking. I remember one evening I was making my rounds with Nurse Evelyn, an older woman who'd been there longer than anyone. She nodded toward Margaret's door and whispered, "She keeps asking for it back." "For what back?" I asked. "The thing they took out of her," Evelyn said softly. "She says it wasn't hers to give." That gave me a chill. From that day on, Margaret became my least favorite room to check. The air always felt colder near her door, even though the old heating system was unpredictable everywhere in the building. Sometimes I'd hear her murmuring late at night, not crying, not calling for help, just whispering low rhythmic words that didn't sound like English. Once, I heard her laugh. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused, hollow, like she was laughing through herself. We all noticed strange things around her room. Lights flickered even after maintenance checked the wiring. The call bell would go off at 3 a.m. Sharp every night, even though Margaret was always lying perfectly still when we rushed in. One of the younger nurses swore she saw her sitting up, tracing the air above her stomach with her fingers, mumbling, "It still moves." When she reported it to the supervising doctor, he dismissed it as morphine hallucinations. But the nurse, she quit a week later. By the end of that month, half of the staff refused to take the East Wing shift alone, and that's when the real incident happened. Climactic horror. It was a Wednesday night, October 18th, 1978. Rain was hammering against the windows, and the whole building felt alive with static. We were short-staffed. 2 nurses had called in sick, and the generator had already flickered twice. I was doing my rounds when I heard it, a sharp, panicked scream from down the hall. "Help! Someone get in here!" It was Nurse Evelyn's voice. I sprinted down the corridor, my shoes slipping on the waxed linoleum. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed violently, some flickering so fast they stuttered the world in half-second frames. When I burst into Margaret's room, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Metallic, thick, and wrong. Blood was everywhere. Margaret was sitting up in bed, her hospital gown soaked through, her hands deep in the open wound of her stomach. Her incision, the one stapled shut just 3 days earlier, was torn wide open, glistening red under the harsh light. She was holding something in her hands. At first, I thought it was her intestines, but when I looked closer, my stomach turned. It looked like she'd pulled out a length of pink tissue, slick and pulsing faintly, like it was alive. But what made me freeze was that she wasn't in pain. Not even a flinch. She just looked up at us, calm, almost annoyed, as if we'd interrupted her. Evelyn screamed again and tried to grab her wrists, but Margaret's strength was unreal. She pushed the nurse back with one hand, eyes locked on that thing she was holding. "It doesn't belong here," she whispered. Her voice was raspy low. "It keeps moving. It keeps talking." Blood was running down her arms, dripping onto the sheets. I stumbled backward, gagging. I wanted to help, but every part of my body screamed to get out. Then I saw it, something small and metallic glinting inside the wound. It looked like a piece of the crucifix. The same one they said she'd swallowed? She reached in again, deeper, her fingers trembling but determined. Evelyn shouted for me to restrain her, but I couldn't move. When she pulled her hand back this time, she wasn't holding metal. She was holding something black, wet, pulsing, and for one horrifying second, it looked like it opened, like it had a tiny mouth. Margaret smiled. "See? I told them it wasn't mine." Then she started laughing, that hollow, broken sound again, as she pressed the black thing to her chest, like a child holding a doll. By the time security arrived, she'd collapsed. The surgeons rushed her back into the operating room, but she never regained consciousness. They said she died of shock and blood loss, but that's not the part that haunts me most. After they'd taken her body away, I stayed behind to help clean. The sheets were soaked red, and the floor was slick. When I pulled the top layer of bedding away, something small fell out. A tiny metal fragment. It wasn't shaped like a crucifix anymore. It looked melted, distorted, almost fused with something organic. I picked it up with tweezers and dropped it into the medical waste bin without thinking. But later that night, when I passed the bin again, I swear I heard a faint metallic clicking from inside. Like something moving, like something alive. Aftermath, they told us to keep quiet. The official report said Margaret suffered a post-surgical psychotic break, that she tore open her wound during a dissociative episode, and that she was dead before help arrived. That's what went into the records. But that's not what I saw. Evelyn never came back after that night. She handed in her resignation the next morning, hands shaking as she filled out the form. I tried to stay. For a while, but things changed after Margaret died. Some nights, patients down the hall would start screaming for no reason. They'd say they could hear scratching inside the walls, or that someone was whispering in the vents. Maintenance had found nothing, but one of them refused to go into her room after claiming he smelled blood, even though it had been cleaned a dozen times. I avoided that wing altogether. But once, months later, I had to deliver new linens there. As I passed her old room, I froze. The door was sealed shut now, marked storage. But from behind it, faintly, I could have sworn I heard someone humming. It was the same rhythm Margaret used to hum when she thought no one was listening. I dropped the linens and left. 2 weeks later, I quit St. Augustine for good. I tried to move on, found work at a smaller clinic, got married, had kids. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her again, sitting up in that bed, her hands slick with blood, looking calm as the world fell apart around her. And worse, I sometimes dream of that thing she pulled out. It's always moving, always talking. YouTube outro, if you ever find yourself working late at a hospital, and you hear someone humming from a locked room, don't open the door. Some things are better left undisturbed, because not everything we cut out of the human body wants to stay gone. What would you have done that night? Would you have tried to stop her or run like I should have? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, chilling tales from the dark corners of the human mind. Sleep well, if you can.